Hey guys, welcome to Entertainment Talk Nation. This is Rob. This video, we're going to continue the best of the best series, which I started about, 2 months ago now. We had the holidays, we had the New Year's, I had work, so it's been a while since we've done a video once again, but we are going to continue this series. I plan to finish it one way or another, whether I do all the videos within the next 2 months or the next year, it's going to get done. Now, this time we're looking at the best of the best for the Versus Godzilla movies in the Heisei series. And this one is stacked with Versus movies. Pretty much the whole era is Versus movies, except Return of Godzilla. So, without any further ado, we're going to get started. And we start off with Godzilla versus Biollante. Now, when this movie came out, even before I got to see it here in the States, it wasn't very well received. It's amazing how this movie has garnered so much love over the last 10 years. Even when I started doing this channel, Godzilla vs. Biollante wasn't a highly touted movie, but over time, people have grown to love it. Now, one thing I like about this movie is Biollante in and of herself. Her second form in particular, fantastic design, but I've never been very fond of the story. Now, in terms of a versus, this is an epic fight these two monsters have. Biollante is clearly much larger. Biollante is extraordinarily powerful, does a lot of damage to Godzilla in this movie, and it turns out to be an epic fight, and Godzilla has to go to his nuclear post once he's about to be consumed by Biollante, and eventually he's the victor. You know, the movie is, like I said, Biollante, the fight, that's pretty much the highlights for me personally. Where would it rank in this era? It's kind of hard to tell. It's such a shift. It's so not soughtly looked at fondly when it first came out, and now it's pretty fondly received, but I don't think it's the most popular one of all the other ones in this era. So while it makes a strong entry, you can pretty much safely assume this one's not going to be the best of the best. Now, on to Godzilla versus King Ghidorah. And of course, these two are always an epic fight, whether it was in the 70s, whether it was in the Heisei era, or even in the future as we see now. One of my complaints about this movie is they changed Ghidorah's roar. I like the Showa Ghidorah roar the best. That is my favorite one of all time. But that doesn't take away the fact that having them both in this movie going at it again one-on-one is just epic. And the story is a little bit cheesy, but it's kind of cool. You know, it has to do with time travel, and they show kind of a new origin of Ghidorah, where we have known Ghidorah to be from space in the past. This time Ghidorah is a unique creature from the future that gets left in 1944 Lagos to be irradiated and then used to kind of attack Japan. And basically the story is that Japan becomes an ultra superpower in the future, and they want to prevent that, and that's the whole story. But in terms of the engagement between Godzilla and Ghidorah, the first one is pretty cool, but honestly, I think it's really underwhelming that Ghidorah just basically got his ass handed to him. His middle head got blown off and he was down for the count. We have seen Ghidorah in prior movies take on multiple monsters, and I always felt that Toho many times made Ghidorah just short of being as powerful as he should be. This is where I gotta give kudos to Legendary. They made Ghidorah pretty powerful and pretty OP actually. And then their second engagement, he returns as Mecha King Ghidorah. It's kind of a weird twist of good guy, bad guy, good guy. So they used Godzilla as the good guy, or presented him as the good guy, in order to stop Ghidorah from destroying Japan so that the future villains wouldn't get their way. And then after Godzilla destroys Ghidorah, he goes and does Godzilla things, and suddenly it's like, oh, well, we're gonna need Ghidorah to stop Godzilla from destroying Japan. So they come back with Mecha King Ghidorah, they have a fight, but once again, Godzilla's pretty dominant in this one, and it's hard to really see their epic fights. Me personally, I find it underwhelming simply because Ghidorah is underwhelming. But that's not to take away from the fact that the battles were pretty dope, and the movie is actually pretty decent. Again, it's a little cheesy, M11, we all know, and the Dorats obviously are probably the biggest cheese in this movie. But I always kind of like time travel movies, and this one, I think it's pretty cool that they try to play with time in order to kind of change things up. They were trying to do things a little fresh, and if nothing else, I can at least appreciate that. Will this go down as the best of the best? We'll have to see. It's certainly a solid entry in my opinion. Then we move on to Godzilla versus Mothra. Now, I was considering putting this movie in the Godzilla outnumbered category, best of the best. But I kind of feel that I didn't do it with Godzilla vs. Mothra because he was fighting two babies. These are two fully grown monsters. Batra is probably the strongest of the two between him and Mothra, at least in my opinion. So it's hard to say if he's fighting two fully powered. It was a tough call, but I decided to keep it the way it is because this whole list is just versus monster movies. And Godzilla, I think one-on-one against both of these two would probably wipe the floor with them. So it probably needs to be an even match by having both of them in the movie. So I'm keeping it in the versus category. I'm not going to put it in the outnumbered category because I do think that if Godzilla faced any one of them solo, he would probably win. With that said, this has never been my personal favorite. I never really liked Batra. There's probably a reason why we only ever saw Batra once. And, it's just the whole tale. And then Batra starts off bad, then becomes friends with Mothra to team up against Godzilla. And there's just something that it's just not for me. I think actually this one, when we talk to among ourselves or when I hear people in forums talking about this movie or talking about the Heisei series in general, I don't really hear this movie come up a whole lot, and with good reason. I don't think it's anywhere near the best in the series, so this is another one you could probably safely assume is not going to be best of the best. Now we move on to Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla II, and this right here, very good versus movie. I mean, Godzilla gets wrecked by Mechagodzilla. Now look, I'm always going to be partial to 1970s Mechagodzilla for two reasons. Number one, I just think it's the best look. And number two, I like the fact that he was a creation by aliens and they used him in order to destroy the Earth's monsters and stuff like that. Where this one, it's human controlled. Not a huge fan of that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Mechagodzilla in this movie is incredibly powerful. And of course, there's Rodan in it. Again, there's another question. Well, would this be an outnumbered? Not really. He fights Rodan in the beginning, then Rodan saves him in the end. It's kind of like breaks it even. Plus, Rodan is tiny in this movie. But this fight is incredible. And this movie is very solid. And again, 1970s Mechagodzilla. I love Terror of Mechagodzilla as well. But I'd be lying, despite the fact that I'm not a fan of this Mechagodzilla, I'd be lying if I said that this wasn't a solid entry into the Heisei series. And seeing Godzilla come up against an opponent that nearly destroys him, that's the kind of fight we look for when he has a villain. This is why Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is so disappointing for me in that respect. Because to me, Ghidorah should be his number one arch villain, and he always seems to either have help when he fights Ghidorah, or when he does solo Ghidorah, he kind of overpowers him. So Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, definitely a big time player for best of the best in versus movies for the Heisei series. Now, moving on, Godzilla versus SpaceGodzilla. Now, I'm not a Space Godzilla fan. I always thought it was a lazy design. You just take Godzilla, you get him big shoulder pads, a little crown, and then you call it a day. That's number one. Number two, I'm not a big fan of Baby Godzilla. The whole being kidnapped and... But, objectively speaking, I know that there are a lot of people who love this movie. I know that there are a lot of people who love Space Godzilla. And I know that this is kind of where Mickey starts to become more prominent. I mean, I know she's in the prior movies, but she kind of becomes more prominent here because of her relationship with Baby Godzilla and being able to either communicate or kind of understand where Baby Godzilla is coming from. With that said, I can admit that in terms of power and in terms of what he's capable of, Space Godzilla is definitely a challenge for Godzilla. And of course we have if I'm not mistaken, the Mothra is in this one. Again, we're not going to really consider that when we look at this versus movie because Mothra is not really by itself a challenge to Space Godzilla or Godzilla for that matter. But, again, trying to be objective, not trying to put my own feelings into what this decision is going to be. In terms of the fight, in terms of the battle, it is a challenge. It is a good fight. You got all these crystals coming up from the floor, and Space Godzilla's got all these crazy powers. I do like how they link it to some of the earlier movies. So I think this one definitely has to be considered. As much as I hate to say that, I do think it needs to be considered when you look at the power level of SpaceGodzilla, the challenge he presents, the story. Even though I consider it cheesy, a lot of people like this stuff, but the story in terms of saving baby Godzilla, things like that. So as much as I want to not consider this, it is heavily being considered for the best of the best in the Heisei series, no doubt. And finally, we move on to Godzilla versus Destoroyah. And this is the capstone for this era. In this one, of course, we all know Godzilla is melting down, it's having a nuclear meltdown that's going to threaten the Earth. And in the process, while this is happening, while Japan's trying to deal with that, they are kind of blind to the fact that there is another monster that was created by the oxygen destroyer, and it's growing, it's multiplying, it's killing people. There's a real good horror element to the earlier part of this movie when Destoroyah is not gigantic, when there's many of them and they're basically 6, 7, 8 feet tall and they're running around killing people. That is really cool. That is one of the best parts of this movie. However, later on, he gets bigger, obviously. My only criticism with this movie, when Godzilla and Destoroyah fight each other, is the fact that there's just projectile heaven. I mean, we're talking about blast after blast after blast, but that doesn't take away the stakes. I think it was a very good choice to not only have Godzilla have a enemy to fight, but also the fact that he's dealing with dying. He's basically dying while he's trying to fight this monster. Plus you have the element of Godzilla Jr., which at this point I'm okay with Godzilla Jr. It's the little baby ones. Once they're like Junior, that's okay. I'm cool with that. And the element of him in this movie and what he means. So a lot of things from the Heisei era almost kind of culminate and come to a head in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. And when you take into effect that Destoroyah and Junior had an epic battle, and then Godzilla and Destoroyah's epic battle on top of that, and then the ending, which I know some of you admit to tearing up at the end of the movie when you were much younger. I was not. I was a teenager, so I was okay with it. I did my crying for Return of Godzilla. But this is definitely a great end to this era. And looking at this whole list of movies for the Heisei era, I would say this one and 2 others are probably the best contention for best of the best. So let's see which one it is. And for best of the best Godzilla vs. movie for the Heisei era, it's gotta be Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. I think it's a clear winner. I think Mechagodzilla II is a great competitor. And I think what gives Godzilla vs. Destoroyah the edge over the other two, and specifically Mechagodzilla 2, because I do think Mechagodzilla 2, I think what happens to him towards the end as Mechagodzilla is about to kill him is a little bit more impactful, in my opinion. Again, I know people see the meltdown and that's more impactful for them, but that wasn't caused by Destoroyah. That was just natural. Where in Mechagodzilla 2, basically at that point you could argue that Mechagodzilla in that particular movie is the closest one that's probably ever come to killing Godzilla outright. But the reason I chose Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is because a lot of the story elements, some subplots that started from the moment Godzilla vs. Biollante came out up until now, a lot of the little elements, subplots, all culminate and come to a head in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. And I thought, even though some of these stories are cheesy, overall that's good writing, is when you can add stories together and there's a link to everything, even though across multiple movies, right? And then the ending is very dramatic. To see Godzilla just die naturally, even though Junior takes the mantle at the end, but we know that that's Junior, and before Junior was Godzilla, and the OG had died at that point. And I also think that the scene with Junior, where he gets wrecked by Destoroyah, obviously that's a big deal. So there's just a lot of good elements in the movie. The fighting is great. It's projectile heavy, but it does really display Destoroyah as very, very powerful, albeit a glass cannon in my opinion. I think he can dish it out. I don't think he can really take it. But overall, I think Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is certainly the best of the best for the Heisei era in Godzilla vs. movies. Anyway, That's it for this one, guys. Let me know in the comment section, do you believe Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is the best versus movie in the Heisei era? Or is there one particular one that you yourself would consider the best of the best? This is Rob signing off for ETN, where we don't do news, we just talk entertainment. Take it easy.